Chris Martin had it all. A quiet, sunlit suburb like Maplewood, where the air held the soft promise of another predictable day. A cozy house he'd made his own. A wife named Sarah, and a small two-bedroom home at the end of a tree-lined cul-de-sac. It was an unexpected find that came together perfectly just before their wedding. It was a sanctuary of comfort and love, with no signs of Chris watched Sarah as she slept beside him. Her dark hair fanned out across the pillow, her face serene in the golden glow filtering through the curtains. There was something about her presence that calmed him. It made him feel like his life was on solid ground. They had only been married for 4 months, but their bond already felt unshakable. It was as if the threads of their love had been woven for years. Their wedding had been simple and intimate. It was a gathering of close family and friends. It was a garden party in full bloom, with friends and family gathered in the warmth of the late spring sun. It wasn't a lavish affair, but it was perfect for them. Chris still remembered those moments every day, and in the quiet morning light, they played in his mind like a dream. He got up gently and went down the hallway to the kitchen. The house, it was so peaceful in the early morning light. It felt like the embodiment of the life he had always wanted. There was a comfort in its silence. It felt like everything was in place as it should be. Chris got busy making breakfast. His mind wandered to thoughts of their future together. He was building a life with Sarah brick by brick. But beneath that sense of contentment, there was something else. Something unspoken. Something he couldn't quite name. A small part of him couldn't help but wonder if there were things about Sarah. As he moved through the hallway and into the kitchen, he noticed the silence of the house enveloping him. It was the kind of stillness Chris had come to appreciate in recent months, a far cry from the constant buzz of his previous life in the city. Here, there was peace, and with Sarah by his side, it felt like the beginning of something steady, something unshakable. He busied himself with breakfast. The gentle sizzle of eggs in the pan and the soft crackling of toast broke the silence. His mind wandered as he cooked, thinking about the little moments that had led to this point. How he and Sarah had met, the quick progression from strangers to lovers, and then almost too soon, husband and wife. They hadn't known each other for long before he proposed, just shy of a year. But everything had felt right. He had never questioned the timing. Even now he didn't. But there was something, a nagging thought he could never quite pin down. Chris wasn't questioning Sarah or their relationship. He was sure of their love and even more sure of the life they were building. But every now and then, when he allowed his mind to drift, he wondered about Sarah's past. She didn't talk about it much, at least not in detail. He knew the broad strokes. How she had grown up in a different city, how she had moved to Riverview to start fresh, how there had been Chris respected her privacy and knew that she preferred not to discuss her difficult family situation. Everyone has things they don't want to relive, and it left a gap that sometimes bothered him in ways he couldn't quite explain. Sarah was everything he had ever wanted, but she was also an enigma. There were moments when she would retreat into herself, her eyes distant, and her smile not quite reaching her lips. Chris had chalked it up to the usual stresses of married life. The adjustment to living with someone new, blending routines and habits. But every now and then, he couldn't help but feel there was something more. He poured 2 cups of coffee, setting them on the small table by the window overlooking the backyard. Their yard was a modest space bordered by a wooden fence with a patch of grass and a few scattered flower beds. Sarah had taken a liking to gardening, spending her free time planting and nurturing the flowers that now bloomed brightly. Chris loved how Sarah could make the simplest things seem alive and beautiful. Chris was pulled from his thoughts by the faint sound of a creak behind him. He turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway. Her hair was tousled from sleep, and her eyes were soft with the remnants of a dream. She was wearing one of his old shirts, the fabric hanging loosely around her frame. She smiled at him, and he felt his heart skip a beat. "Morning," she murmured. Her voice was still sleepy. He replied, motioning to the table he'd made breakfast on. Sarah walked over and kissed him on the cheek before sitting down at the table. She wrapped her hands around the warm mug of coffee, took a sip, and sighed softly. "You spoil me," she said with a teasing smile. But there was warmth behind her words. Chris chuckled. "I just want to keep you around," he said. They fell into an easy rhythm as they often did, talking about nothing in particular, sharing stories about their week, and making plans for the weekend. It was the kind of Chris had always craved ordinary happiness, the kind that felt solid and dependable. As they talked, a thought lingered in the back of his mind, unbidden but persistent. There's more to her. Later that afternoon, as the sun reached its zenith and bathed the town in a warm glow, Chris found himself wandering through the house while Sarah was out tending to her garden. His gaze lingered on the small details, like the framed photos of their wedding on the wall and the little knickknacks they had collected during their short time together. Their life seemed so idyllic, so perfectly aligned. But there was still that nagging feeling that something was missing. They had collected various trinkets during their short time together. Their life seemed idyllic and perfectly aligned, but there was still that nagging feeling that something was missing. Until this happened. He wandered into their bedroom, drawn by an inexplicable pull. He wasn't one to snoop. Trust had always been paramount in their relationship. But something was gnawing at him today, something he couldn't ignore. He ran his hands along the neat row of Sarah's dresses and blouses. Everything was in order as it always was. His hand paused over a small leather-bound journal tucked away on the top shelf. Chris hadn't noticed it before, but that wasn't unusual. Sarah was meticulous with her belongings, and he didn't often go through her things. Still, curiosity got the better of him, so he pulled the journal down. His fingers traced the smooth leather cover. He hesitated for a moment. The weight of his actions sinking in, he knew he shouldn't, but the thought that had been nagging at him for weeks was louder now, urging him on. He opened the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. The pages were filled with neat, flowing handwriting, unmistakably Sarah's. As he skimmed the entries, his brow furrowed. There were parts that didn't make sense, things that seemed out of place. Mention of doctors. Visits were vague about treatments, and most puzzling of all, there was an entry about the change. Chris's pulse quickened as he read on. His mind raced to make sense of what he was seeing. His stomach turned. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he suddenly wished he hadn't opened the journal at all. He closed it with a shaky hand and slid it back onto the shelf. He tried to ignore the cold sweat that had broken out across his skin. He heard the sound of the back door opening. Sarah's voice floated through the house, calling for him. Chris quickly shut the closet door and tried to calm his breathing. He had a feeling that something was wrong, but he wasn't ready to confront it. He found Sarah in the kitchen, washing her hands at the sink. She smiled when she saw him. Her eyes crinkled at the corners in that way that always melted his heart. "How are you?" she asked. I asked, tilting my head slightly. Chris forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, just thinking," Sarah said, giving him a quizzical look, but not pressing further. Instead, she wiped her hands on a towel and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Come outside with me," she said, resting her head against his chest. "It's a beautiful day," Chris said, his mind still racing with the words he had read in the journal. He followed her outside, but the weight of what he had discovered lingered. The days that followed Chris's discovery of Sarah's journal passed by in a blur. The words he'd read lingered in his mind, gnawing at him. The phrase change had been innocuous at first, just a couple of words scribbled in Sarah's handwriting. But the more he thought about it, the more it unsettled him. What change? Why hadn't she ever mentioned anything significant about her past? Chris had always known there was something Sarah wasn't telling him. From the beginning, she'd been secretive about her life before they met. He had asked her early in their relationship about her family, her childhood, her friends, but her answers were always vague. "I had a difficult time growing up. There were things I had to leave behind." He had never pushed, trusting that she would open up when she was ready. But now, after finding that journal, his patience had worn thin. What was she hiding? He had this feeling that it was something big, something that could rock the foundation of their marriage. The journal had opened a door into Sarah's past that Chris hadn't even known existed, and now that it was cracked open, he couldn't ignore it. As days passed, he found himself consumed by thoughts of what else Sarah might be keeping from him. He couldn't ask her directly, not yet, not without understanding more, but the weight of not knowing went at him, pulling him deeper into his after a long day of pretending everything was fine. Chris sat alone in the living room nursing a beer. Sarah was in the shower, and he stared at the half-empty bottle in his hand, his mind racing with questions. He wasn't sure he wanted answers to them. He couldn't keep up the facade of a normal marriage much longer. The more time passed, the harder it became to look at it. Chris was sitting at home with Sarah when his phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a message from a colleague reminding him about an upcoming meeting. He glanced at it briefly before setting the phone back down. But his eyes caught on something sticking out from under the couch cushion. He reached down and pulled it out. It was a small photo, slightly crumpled at the edges. He stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. The woman in the photo looked like Sarah, but not quite. Her hair was shorter, her features softer, and there was something about her expression, something vulnerable, almost shy, that was different from the confident, self-assured woman Chris had fallen in love with. For a moment, he wasn't sure if it was Sarah at all. The resemblance was uncanny, but there was something off. He flipped the photo over looking for a date or a name, but there was nothing. Just the image of a woman who looked like his wife, but also the sound of the shower turning off upstairs pulled him from his thoughts. He quickly slipped the photo into his pocket. His heart was pounding. He needed to know more. He needed to understand what was going on. He needed to understand why Sarah had never mentioned this before. That night, as they lay in bed, Chris couldn't bring himself to sleep. Sarah lay beside him. Her breathing was slow and steady. But Chris could feel the distance between them growing wider with each passing day. He couldn't stop thinking about the photo, about the journal, about all the things Sarah hadn't told him. He had always trusted her, always believed in their love. But now he wasn't sure. Was she lying to him? Was there something about her past that she didn't want him to know? The next morning, Chris made up his mind. He couldn't continue living in the dark. He had to confront her to get to the bottom of this once and for all. As they sat down to breakfast, Chris could barely touch his food. He kept glancing at Sarah, who seemed oblivious to his inner turmoil. He watched Sarah, who seemed unaware of his inner turmoil. She smiled at him, her eyes warm and full of love. However, this only made his stomach tighten further. Eventually, he sat down, placed his fork on the table, and took a deep breath. "Sarah," he began, his voice tense, "there's something I need to ask you." Sarah looked up from her plate, her smile fading slightly as she noticed the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft but cautious. Chris hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of what he was about to say. It had the potential to change everything between them. He couldn't hold it in any longer. He found a photo and slowly watched her, carefully. Sarah's face went pale. She sat down, her fork and hands trembling slightly. She asked him what photo he had found. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Chris reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled picture. He placed it on the table between them. Sarah stared at it, her expression unreadable for a long moment. She didn't say anything. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, until finally she looked up at him. "Where did you find this?" she asked. Her voice was shaking. "It was under the couch," Chris replied. His voice was trembling too. "I don't understand. This doesn't look like me, Chris." Sarah interrupted, her voice stronger but still emotional. "It's me." She paused, closing her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. "Before I transitioned." Chris stared at her, the words not fully registering at first. When they finally did, it was like the ground had been pulled out from under him. "Transitioned," he repeated, his voice hollow. Sarah nodded, tears spilling down. Her cheeks were now flushed. "Chris, I was assigned male at birth." For a long moment, Chris couldn't speak. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions. He was shocked, confused, angry, and betrayed. He felt like the room was spinning, like he couldn't catch his breath. Everything he thought he knew about his wife and their life together was crumbling before him. "You're telling me you were a man?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "I was never a man," Sarah said. Her voice was breaking. "I've always been a woman, Chris. I just didn't have the right body to reflect that, so I transitioned years before we met. I didn't want to hide it from you, but I was scared. I was scared you wouldn't accept me, that you'd leave me." Chris shook his head, unable to process the torrent of emotions crashing over him. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you keep this from me?" "I didn't think it mattered," Sarah said, her voice pleading. "I thought we could build a life together without my past getting in the way." I didn't want to lose you, Chris. I love you. I've always loved you. Chris stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. You should have told me, he said, his voice rising. I had a right to know. No, Sarah whispered, her tears falling freely. Now I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But Chris couldn't hear her anymore. His mind was spinning. He saw images of their wedding, their honeymoon, and every moment they'd shared together. It all felt tainted like a lie. He stormed out of the house and slammed the door behind him. He needed air, space, and time away from her and this whole situation. He drove aimlessly for hours, his mind a blur of anger and confusion. He couldn't wrap his head around it. The woman he'd married and loved wasn't who he thought she was. How could she have kept something like this from him? How could she have lied to him for so long? By the time he returned home, it was dark. The house was silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the refrigerator. Chris walked through the empty rooms. His heart was heavy with a mixture of sorrow and rage. When he reached their bedroom, he found Sarah sitting on the edge of the bed. Her face was streaked with tears. She looked up at him as he entered. Her eyes were full of pain and regret. Please, she whispered, her voice raw. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you. You're my husband. You mean everything to me. But Chris couldn't meet her gaze. He couldn't find the words to respond. He felt like his whole world had been turned upside down, like the foundation of their marriage had been ripped out from under him. He turned away and walked out of the room without a word. He needed time to think, time to figure out what this meant for them and for their future. But deep part of him was afraid that things would never be the same again. The days that followed the revelation were pretty rough. Chris couldn't look at Sarah the same way every time she spoke. Every time she tried to reach out to him, all he could hear was the lie she had been living, the lie she had made him part of. He found himself unable to sleep, pacing the empty house at odd hours of the night, his mind replaying her words over and over again. I'm transgender. Those three simple words had shattered his world. He'd married Sarah, the woman who had captivated him and made him believe in love and trust. But now everything felt wrong. He tried to recall their wedding and their honeymoon, but every memory was tainted and poisoned by the secret she'd kept from him. Sarah tried to give him space at first, but it became clear to her that Chris wasn't coping well. She reached out to him, trying to explain and show him that her love was real and that she was real, but Chris couldn't see it. Every time he looked at her, all he saw was the person he thought he knew. What had been a peaceful, idyllic life was now a whirlwind of doubt, anger, and confusion. The woman he thought he'd married was gone, replaced by a version of her that carried secrets too heavy for him to bear. She tried to explain and show him that her love was real and that she was real, but Chris couldn't see it. Every time he looked at her, all he saw was the person he thought he knew unraveling before his eyes. What had been a peaceful, idyllic life was now a whirlwind of doubt, anger, and confusion. The woman he thought he had married was gone, replaced by a version of her that carried secrets too heavy for him to bear. The tension between them grew with each passing day. As time went on, Chris became increasingly isolated, finding it challenging to communicate with Sarah. He avoided her, spending more time out of the house, sometimes driving aimlessly for hours, and other times staying at work long after the office had emptied. When he was home, the atmosphere was tense, and the unspoken words and unanswered questions hung like a dark cloud. Sarah tried to bridge the distance, but every effort she made only seemed to push Chris further away. Nights became especially difficult, and the bed they had once shared became a source of pain. The space where they had laughed and made love now felt like a battleground. Chris would lie on his side, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts spiraling out of control. Sarah would turn toward him, her hand hesitantly reaching out, only to pull back when he didn't respond. The physical distance between them was mirrored in the emotional chasm that had grown larger with every day since the revelation. One evening, as Chris sat in the living room with a drink in hand, Sarah approached him cautiously. She'd been trying to avoid confrontation, hoping that Chris would eventually come to terms with her past. But now it seemed like the only way to move forward was to talk and address the issues that had been festering between them. Chris, she began, her voice soft and almost pleading. Can we talk? Please. Chris didn't look up from his drink. He stared into the amber liquid, his jaw clenched tight. Talk about what? He replied, his voice calm. About us? About everything? Sarah took a deep breath. I know things have been hard. Since I told you that we can't keep living like this, I love you, Chris. I've always loved you, and I know you love me. We can get through this if we just talk. Chris scoffed and finally met her gaze. His eyes were cold and hardened by the weeks of internal conflict. You think we can just talk our way out of this? You think words are going to fix the fact that you've been lying to me since the day we met? I never lied to you. You, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. I was afraid, Chris. I was afraid of losing you. I was afraid you wouldn't love me if you knew the truth. But I'm still the same person you fell in love with. That hasn't changed. Chris slammed his glass down on the table, causing Sarah to flinch. Hasn't changed, he shouted. Everything has changed. You're not the person I thought you were. You've been keeping this huge part of yourself from me. From you. I expect you to understand that I can't just pretend it doesn't matter. Sarah's voice broke as she started to cry. It doesn't change who I am. I've always been a woman. I've always loved you. Please, Chris, I need you to understand. Chris stood up abruptly. His body was trembling with rage. I don't understand anything anymore. He said, I don't even know who I am when I'm with you. You turn my whole life upside down. She took a step toward him, her arms outstretched as if to comfort him. But Chris recoiled, his anger flaring again. Don't touch me, he growled. I can't do this, Sarah. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not for a moment. Sarah stood frozen, her arms falling limply to her sides. She had known this was a possibility, but hearing the words from Chris's mouth and seeing the hatred in his eyes was more painful than she had imagined. She had thought that their love and bond would be enough to get through this. But now, standing there in the cold, empty space between them, she realized that maybe she had been wrong. I'm sorry, she whispered. Let's work through this together. Don't let your past affect our relationship. I'm not saying you should forget about your past, but we need to focus on the present and the future. I'm not sure I can do that. Sarah felt a tear well up in her eye, but she blinked it back. She turned and walked out of the room, leaving Chris alone with his thoughts. Chris's thoughts turned into weeks of tension. The once happy home had become a place of silence, resentment, and unspoken anger. Chris couldn't forgive Sarah, and Sarah didn't know how to fix the growing divide between them. They had become strangers living under the same roof, but existing in completely different worlds. One night, the silence became too much. Chris couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with thoughts of the past, the present, and the future. He got out of bed and he wandered through the house, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He found himself in the garage, where he often went to clear his mind. But tonight, the garage felt suffocating. The weight of his emotions pressed down on him as he sat on the old workbench. His mind drifted back to that day, the day he found the journal, the moment he realized that his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. He had loved Sarah. He had trusted her with everything. And now he felt like he felt betrayed in the worst way possible. His anger, which had been building up for weeks, finally came out. He grabbed a wrench from the workbench and held it tightly in his hand. His heart was racing as he stared at the cold metal. His mind was racing with thoughts of revenge and retribution. Just then, the door to the garage creaked open. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale and tear-streaked. She had heard Chris get up and had followed him, hoping that this time they could finally talk and resolve the tension that had been building between them. Chris, she said softly, stepping into the garage. Can we talk, please? Chris didn't respond. He just stared at her, his eyes dark with rage. Sarah took another step forward, her voice trembling. I know you're angry. I know you feel betrayed, but I never wanted to hurt you. I love you, Chris. I've always loved you. Chris stood up slowly, the wrench still in his hand. His body was tense. His mind was clouded with fury. You love me, he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. How can you say that after what you've done, after lying to me for all this time? Sarah shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I didn't lie to you. I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't accept me for who I am. Maybe I was right." The word struck a nerve. Chris's anger flared. He stepped toward her, his body trembling with rage. "Have you told me? You should have given me a choice. You took that from me." Sarah flinched at his outburst, but she stood her ground. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But her apology only fueled his rage. He couldn't control it anymore. All the anger, all the hurt, all the betrayal. It was too much. Chris raised the wrench and swung it with all his strength. The wrench connected. Chris swung the wrench with a sickening crack, and the sound echoed in the small garage for a moment. Everything went still. Chris stood frozen, his hand still gripping the wrench, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around her head. Her eyes were wide with shock and stared up at him, but there was no recognition in them. They were just confused, then nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Chris stared down at her, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had done. He'd just done the wrench, and it slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor beside her. He knelt down and reached out to touch her, but she didn't move or respond. Panic surged through him, and he shook her gently, calling her name. "Sarah, Sarah, wake up, please wake up." But she didn't, and he couldn't. The reality of what he'd done hit him like a freight train, and Chris stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He had killed his wife for a long time. He just sat there staring at her lifeless body, unable to move. The blood on the floor glistened under the harsh light of the garage, filling the air with a metallic scent. Chris's mind was blank numb. He couldn't think, feel, or breathe. When he finally stood up, it felt like his body was moving on autopilot. He stepped over Sarah's body, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He left the garage and stepped into the night air, but it didn't register. He was too consumed by the gravity of his actions. His heart pounded as he made his way through the house, unable to face the garage where everything had unraveled. He couldn't bear to look back. The reality of his actions was starting to sink in. What had he done? He had loved Sarah. Was the person he loved ever truly real? The rage, confusion, and pain that had fueled the violence drained from him, leaving behind a hollow emptiness. He could hear the sound of his own breath, ragged, shallow, and the distant chirping of crickets outside, as if mocking the stillness that now consumed his world. Chris stood there in the kitchen, unable to think clearly, staring blankly into the distance. His mind couldn't process what had happened or what his life would be like now. In the span of minutes, his once idyllic life had become a nightmare. His marriage, which had seemed so perfect, was now shattered in ways he could never have imagined. He glanced at his phone on the counter. It was glowing faintly in the dim light. He knew he had to call someone. He needed to call the police and an ambulance. He needed to make this nightmare real. He needed to confirm that what had just happened wasn't a twisted dream. But his hands wouldn't move. His body refused to cooperate. He was paralyzed. Chris sank into a chair at the kitchen table, burying his face in his hands. His mind raced back to the moments before everything fell apart. There was their wedding and their mornings together. There was Sarah's smile as she worked in the garden. How did it come to this? How had everything unraveled so quickly? He sat there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Eventually, reality began to sink in. He faced the consequences of what had happened. He faced the finality. All of it began to weigh heavily on his mind. There was no going back now. Sarah was gone, and he was responsible. Trembling hands, Chris reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of what to do next. He knew he had to call the police and face the consequences of his actions. But the thought of what would come next, being arrested, going to trial, spending years in prison, sent a wave of panic through him. He thought about running for a fleeting moment. The idea crossed his mind. He could leave, disappear, start over somewhere else, try to forget what had happened. But even as the thought took shape, he knew it was impossible. There was no escaping this. The weight of what he had done would follow him wherever he went. Finally, with a shaking hand, Chris dialed 911. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered on the other end. "At 911, what's your emergency?" Chris opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat felt tight, his chest was heavy. He swallowed hard and forced the words out. "I need help," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's been an accident." The operator's voice remained calm and professional. "What kind of accident?" Chris shook his head, even though the operator couldn't see him. "Nope, I'm not hurt, but my wife." He couldn't finish the sentence. The reality of what had happened was too much to bear. Tears filled his eyes as he choked on the words. "Where are you right now, sir?" Chris gave his address, his voice shaking. The operator assured him that help was on the way and instructed him to stay on the line, but Chris couldn't hear her anymore. His mind was somewhere else, lost in the flood of guilt, regret, and disbelief that consumed him. Minutes later, flashing lights filled the quiet street outside their home. The police arrived first, followed by paramedics. Chris barely registered their presence as the officers went into the house and found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly ahead while the paramedics rushed to the garage. It didn't take long for them to realize there was nothing they could do for Sarah. Her injuries were too severe. She was already gone. One of the paramedics called it in while the others began to secure the scene. Chris sat in silence as the police questioned him. He answered their questions, and his voice was monotone and detached. He told them what had happened. He told them about how he'd found out about Sarah's past, how their relationship had gone downhill, and how the argument had turned violent. He didn't try to defend himself or make excuses. He knew he was guilty and that there was no way to undo what had been done. Chris Wilkins was led out of his house in handcuffs. The weight of his actions settled on him like a heavy fog. The garage, now a crime scene, symbolized everything that had gone wrong. Wrong in his life, the media quickly picked up on the story. Newlyweds, seemingly perfect, shattered by a horrific crime. People speculated about what drove Chris to murder his wife. But the truth of their relationship, their secrets, and the tragic unraveling was something only Chris fully understood. Locked in a prison cell awaiting trial, Chris had all the time in the world. His marriage had begun with love and promise, but it ended in violence. The trial was swift. His claim that the incident, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, and Sarah's family mourned openly in court. They spoke about her life and the struggles she faced after transitioning, describing her as courageous, kind, and full of hope. These qualities made her death even more painful. Chris was sentenced to 25 years with the possibility of parole after 15. His life behind bars became a quiet routine of reflection and guilt. He thought about Sarah every day, the woman he loved and had failed to truly understand. The memories of their wedding were now tainted by the knowledge that he could never undo what he had done. Sarah's family started the Sarah Wilkins Foundation to advocate for transgender rights and raise awareness about the dangers of secrets and shame. Her story became a symbol of the struggles transgender individuals face and the importance of open, honest relationships. The foundation's work turned Sarah's tragic end into a force for positive change. Meanwhile, while Chris was in prison, he worked with counselors to help others understand the consequences of unchecked anger and fear. He wrote letters to Sarah's family to express his remorse, though he knew forgiveness would likely never come. The house where they had lived was sold, and life in the neighborhood continued. But for those who knew Chris and Sarah, their story became a cautionary tale. It was a reminder of how fear and secrets can destroy everything, even the most promising of lives. As the years passed, Chris's story faded from public memory. But Sarah's legacy lived on. She left behind a foundation that became a beacon of hope for others in the transgender community. Chris remained in his cell, haunted by what could have been. He knew that his life would forever be defined by one tragic, irreversible moment.